Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hello and welcome to Fintech Insider Insights. I'm Benjamin Ensor, Director of Research and Strategy at 11FS. On today's episode, in association with Sumsub, we're discussing the alarming rise of fraud in fintech, particularly across the UK and Europe, and exploring what might be driving this increase. We'll also examine the technologies available to fintechs and financial institutions as they work to fight back against the fraudsters. To discuss this, I'm joined by a great panel of industry experts. First of all, we have a Fintech Insider debut for Ilya Brovin, Chief Growth Officer at Sumsub. It's great to have you on the podcast, Ilya. Please would you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about Sumsub and what it is you do there?
Right. So Sumsub, we are a global identity verification platform, combining and securing the whole user journey from onboarding to ongoing monitoring. We've been around for almost 10 years now. We serve over 2,500 clients globally, helping them to onboard individuals and then secure their transactions and activities. I lead effectively strategy at Sumsub, so that's product strategy, market strategy, everything that relates to investors is also in my court, and I am involved in a lot of the strategic partnerships and sort of new developments that we do on our side. I've been around with Sumsub for 3 years. My past experience was actually in investing. I was in private equity for about 15 years.
Fantastic. Welcome. Next, we have another Fintech Insider debut. This is for Vinita Ramtri, who is a senior financial crime leader at a UK challenger bank. Welcome, Vinita. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Thanks, Ben. Glad to meet you all, and thank you for having me here. I work at a challenger bank in the UK, and over the course of my career, I've worked with multiple industries such as hospitality, media, banking, and specifically within banking, I've worked at large incumbents such as Barclays, HSBC, NatWest, solving diverse issues. So I've solved issues right from, embedding good conduct to fraud and financial crime. So you could see me as a strategy and transformation expert or a sort of Swiss Army knife, now applying myself to fraud and fin crime.
Fantastic. Welcome. And completing our hat trick of Fintech Insider debuts today, we have Dave Laramy, SVP and Head of Fraud Management, ABC and Tax Evasion at Danske Bank. Dave, please will you tell our listeners a little bit about you and what your role is at Danske Bank?
Sure. So I've been at Danske Bank living in Copenhagen for the last 2.5 years, but you can probably tell from my accent that I'm not Danish. And so before that, I spent 20 years in fraud and financial crime roles at multiple UK banks, including 2 fintech banks.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to you and welcome to all 3 of you. Okay, let's dive in. So to kick off the show, we're going to be looking at the current state of fraud in fintech and at some of the technologies that are powering new dangers and new vectors for fraud. So the catalyst for this is that Sumsub has just published a new report on the state of fraud in the industry. So, Ilya, we'd like to start by just diving into a couple of the most striking things that we picked out from the report, if we may. One of them was this enormous growth in fraud in fintech from 2023 into 2024. It's kind of alarming reading the report. How scared should everyone be? And what's behind this growth?
Well, I think underlying, first of all, this growth is the growth of the sectors we're talking about. So more and more transactions and people's activity are actually going A, online, B, from more traditional to more of the challenger bank models. And that opens up a lot of new opportunities for fraudsters to attack those businesses and those transactions and activities. There's also a technological aspect to it. There are some technologies that are really aiding the fraudsters in doing that. So I think if you combine those two, that's why you see those alarming rates.
Because what you're reporting is faster growth than in sort of digital commerce. I mean, obviously there are digital retailers out there or whatever that have grown by 156% or whatever. But the growth rates you're reporting are faster than the growth rate of digital commerce. So you're basically saying fraud is becoming worse, it's becoming more acute, it's becoming a bigger problem. This isn't just people moving online. This is fraudsters are winning. You know, they won 2024 basically.
Well, first of all, fraudsters are always a little bit ahead, right? Because they're the ones devising the strategy that businesses and with the help of companies like ours then need to try to tackle it. The question is like, how fast do you do this? I think the technological shift has been pretty unprecedented in terms of growth. You know, AI, and we'll talk about AI and large language models and deepfakes, you know, appeared en masse, you know, you can say, you know, 18 months ago, but the rise has been just skyrocketing, right? And so it's very hard to very quickly catch up and effectively fight that. So yes, there is a bit of an advantage, but we can also talk about how you tackle that. But I would agree with you that in those beginning high growth phase, yes, there's a lag in terms of fighting it.
Now, this research that you've done is international in scope, as is, of course, fraud. But one of the things we did notice was that the UK was among the top 10 European countries by fraud rate growth, which is not how we've done in Evasion over the last few years, alongside Moldova and Belgium. Is there something about British people that's making them particularly susceptible to fraud? Is fraud kind of worse in the UK, or is it just quite bad everywhere and the UK is just maybe just a more obvious target?
I think it's probably the latter. I don't think UK is necessarily worse than others, but I think it's in a very lucrative target, being a developed and a rich market, which is also quite innovative in terms of adopting the new business models. And so, yes, that's just basically a prime target for fraudsters to attack. I think that is the main reason why UK would feature well or highly on this ranking.
I think there's also a language issue there, whereby it's harder for the fraudsters to learn multiple European languages and target those in their native language. I know from personal experience, Danish isn't the easiest language to learn, and finding some fraudsters abroad that might be in some sort of scam call centers and being human trafficked might then lead to a specific targeting of those nations that speak English as their first language.
In addition to that, I also believe that UK population is probably amongst the world's most likely to trust people. So in Europe or around the EU, there's Sweden and Norway, which trust people a lot more. But you see the adoption of open banking and all kind of tells, right, that we're more willing to see that innovation and go, right, I'll go for it. In fact, there's a study done by the Policy Institute at King's College London, which says that in UK, we're likely to trust, I think, 84% of the people that we meet, foreigners, and 54% people we meet for the first time. So that says a lot in terms of, as a fraudster, I have little obstacles, or the obstacles are fewer. Also, the size of the prize is larger, right? So if you see UK population is 67, 68 million. I mean, just over that is Germany at about 84. But other than that, the rest are smaller populated areas. So where would I go? To Dave's point, the language is simpler, there's more people, and the people are more willing to trust me. So it just seems like a no-brainer.
Great. So what else is driving the growth of fraud? I mean, Ilya already brought in a few points. Dave, what are you seeing as some of the other things that are driving the growth in fraud?
I think it's seen as relatively risk-free, but reward high by the criminal community. And they've been investing their ill-gotten gains, if you like, to adopt the latest technology. And that's driving the return on investment further. We see that there is little prosecution in the world of fraud. And when we do see successful prosecutions, the sentencing is relatively weak in the UK compared to other sorts of criminal offences. So you might see things like drugs gangs giving up on that because of the high risk and high sentencing and moving into a world of fraud, where they can work from home without really going outside, and just receiving those funds, knowing that there's little chance of prosecution after that, which I think is a sad state of affairs and something we need to address as an industry. But I think it is reflective of that. Plus, I think there's the kind of amount that you can earn in a small period of time, which you don't get in other industries.
I feel we might persuade some of our listeners to sort of change their line of work if we carry on in this line. Sorry, Vinita, do come in.
Can I just add? I think this is a great point, the chance of prosecution, but also the more I think about this, I think there's also almost that chance of getting compensated for this, right? And forget being in harm's way, but the more you see the new sort of, the APP reimbursement, planning or requirement for the banks and everything else, there's a lot that's being auto decision in some ways, right? Saying, okay, what's worth my time to go after? So as you see a lot of banks or organizations taking that stance to say, okay, this is below £100 or below X amount, I'm not going to go after the fraudster. So as a fraudster, you just got to think that if I operate below this threshold, I can just scale my operation. Right. So I don't want to be convincing anyone here, but what is the deterrent? Because we're not saying it's zero tolerance. We're saying, here's my tolerance. Below that, you can operate and carry on. I don't know, but it just feels like that. And with conduct, when we rolled out conduct, we said there's zero tolerance. But here we're saying, well, I can't go after everything, so I'm only going to go after the big things.
So what else is driving this growth in fraud that Sumsub is reporting? So because obviously, there have always been people who are desperate, all around the world. There have always been people who are willing to break the law. There's always been people who may be just lazy and looking for an easy way of making money. But that doesn't explain the acceleration, and nor do I believe that the growth in digital commerce alone explains the rapid increase in fraud. So what else, maybe Ilya, what else are you seeing that you think is making fraud easier or encouraging the growth of fraud?
Yeah, I think so. Dave already sort of talked about this a little bit. The cost of doing fraud has dropped significantly. We've actually also done some ROI sort of calculations, and it's sort of staggering. You can spend, $1,000 a month, and your expected reward will be in the hundreds of thousands. Wow. And the reason for that is that the tools you can use are very cheap. You can organize large groups of people to be involved in your fraud operation that can be located in absolutely different countries. So there's this also international angle, right? And by the way, why it's very hard to prosecute somebody that's sitting on another continent, right? For something they've done to a UK resident. So I think all of those factors combined really, really drive this. And we've certainly seen a big rise also in, or what we call it fraud networks, or you can call it differently, but basically, completely separate people being involved in the same operation. They might be paid very little, but now with the current technology, this can be done en masse. And that's where you can have high rewards by staying below the threshold Vinita you're talking about, right? At very low cost and have a good ROI. Yes, I mean it's very tough to fight it.
What about artificial intelligence and blockchain? It's hard to have a conversation without fintech. Fintech without mentioning artificial intelligence this year or blockchain in previous years. To what extent are, say, cryptocurrencies or AI factoring in here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I always like to keep this two completely separate. People like to bunch them together because they are kind of hype words, but obviously blockchain and crypto are a very convenient method of making payments, hiding payments. Once the money is out of the fiat system and into the blockchain system, it does become harder to track. Obviously, that's a catalyst. AI does a different job, right? It basically that's the lowering the cost component right now. For if you take deepfakes as one of the fastest rising attack vectors, you can use AI to create very realistic deepfakes of people, and the cost of that will be $10, $15 for an app, and you can create multiple of them. You can launch many attacks. Even if your success rate will be low, your cost is extremely low. So yes, AI definitely plays into driving that. That being said, we can talk about later, like how you use it also to protect. But yes, I think those two are definitely enablers of this.
Vinita, are you seeing that?
I think definitely. So AI is a certain enabler. And even besides using the technology, just dismantling the knowledge. So if I had £1,000, to Ilya's point, saying, here's my investment, I want to start something. And if I think there's no consequences of causing fraud, do I want to start a food truck down the street and start a legit business? Or access global operations somewhere else and plug and play, fraud as a service, utilize that and utilize the tools that are already available and go for that. So it's just made it that much more easy. In fact, I was on ChatGPT this morning and I said, can you tell me how to access, I won't tell you exactly what the command was, but essentially saying, can you tell me how to, get hold of people's personal data? And I got 14 methods straight out there to say, here's how you can go about it. So it's just so set up that it's almost a service you can then go and utilize. And my parents live in India. I was speaking to my father who was telling me about, to watch this documentary about Jamtara, and I watched the Netflix documentary about these fraud centers where it's that easy where you can say, okay, here's my investment. Can you, here's my list of phone calls to be made. Can you get on with it? And it can be done.
Are you seeing the same, Dave? Are you starting to see sort of AI being used in frauds?
Absolutely. I also think that we're seeing AI usage for different purposes. So I think one of the ways it's being used is to share intelligence and ways of working across the criminal community. When you see how many people, for example, are in some of these Telegram groups that are focusing on fraud, it can be in the tens of thousands, sometimes even the hundreds of thousands. So that's the scale of the attack that we're facing. And things like AI can be used to generate instant translations and instant phishing attacks that are at scale, for example, and also to have the first round of conversations with customers to see if they're susceptible to being a victim, which can then be elevated to a human fraudster in the event of a target being found. And that kind of drives the return on investment that we talked about earlier even further.
So one of the things we've sort of touched on in this conversation already is the international nature of fraud. That was part of what was in your report, Ilya, was sort of looking at the impact across the world. Obviously, there are some sort of stereotypes about where fraud comes from and so on. But are there countries around the world that are particularly prone to fraud or have become sources of fraud? I mean, for example, one might imagine that in devastated sort of states, places like, let's say Yemen or Sudan or countries that are going through acute turmoil, people might be more tempted to turn to illegitimate ways of making an income. Are you seeing sort of patterns in fraud around the world?
Definitely, we're seeing that correlation between the economic state and the strength of the institutes in certain countries, correlated very much with where the sources of this traffic are. I don't want to name specific countries here for obvious reasons, but it's a lot of it is from Asia and a lot of it is from Africa. And the reasons, I think, are what you said, and they're quite obvious. There isn't that much you need to sort of overthink here, to be honest. When people, when their living standards are very low, not much to lose. They might not on their own have had the resources, knowledge to engage in those. But as I said, that there are really good organizations behind this that are organizing people effectively. Fraud as a service is the term we also use in the report. You can organize lots of this cheap labor and do a lot of these attacks on cheap. So absolutely that trend is there.
What about state actors? When we look at sort of some of what's going on social media, some of the misinformation that's being spread, there's a growing body of evidence that some of that is being spread by certain states that have political agendas and wish to undermine opposing political parties or opposing countries or whatever. Vinita, this may be an unfair question to ask you, but do you get any sense that there are some state actors involved in fraud on a substantial scale or enabling some of this?
I think there definitely is, right? And one of the cases, I guess some of us follow the Lazarus heist and see the details in terms of what's out there. And one of the when you're talking about certain countries, but if you see the sophistication of fraud with, for example, the Cosmos Bank, there was one of these fraud attacks, right, where I think there was like 12 or something million lost in 2 hours and 19 minutes. But the fraud, the ATM fraud, was across 28 countries. So we're not talking about, specific countries. This is global sort of cross-border fraud. We're talking about cross-border payments. And a lot of it could be, to Ilya's point, it could be people who are struggling with cost of living or different scenarios. But a lot could just be, a lot of them were told that they were just acting in a film. So it was just a shot. So a lot of times people don't realize, and a lot of people think that this is victimless and it's not harming anyone, and the person will be reimbursed by the bank. So many people engage in it thinking, here's the quick way to make some money and no harm's done because the person's got their money back from the bank. So there's a lot more to it than a specific country, and this is a global thing. And there is, of course, like the state aspect is certainly there, of course.
Dave, how much of this is a sort of failure? No, failure is too strong a word. A sort of a lack of focus from regulators and lawmakers around the world, and how much of it is it just to some extent, as Vinita and Ilya are saying, it's just really, really hard to coordinate internationally because you're competing with international criminal networks, and yet the police, if you like, are not set up to operate in quite the same way at the same scale.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, but I think we have to look at the journey that we've been on from a fraud perspective over the course of the last 10 years, where the initial focus was very much on protecting the bank. And we did that by sort of upping the levels of strength of our authentication. We did that through tokenization of cards and contactless. We did that on our online banking and on our e-banking platforms, which are now seeing reductions in fraud significantly year on year. So we do protect the customer and the bank's money. What we're now seeing is the specific targeting of the customer as the weak link in the train to actually drive those payments. And they're by definition more difficult to stop because the traditional payment indicators are there. The customer did make the transaction and did pass all the authentication checks to do that. And so we built warning messages, but customers get fatigue from warning messages. And so they're only effective for so long or when you optimize them. But what we absolutely need is to cut off the ability for the fraudsters to reach the customers. And so we need the social media sites to play their part and actually remove the harm and the fake content that's appearing on their platform of all types, as well as the telcos to help us work to block the SMSs and the emails and things coming through to customers' devices that are absolutely fraudulent. So it needs to be a joined up intra-industry approach to actually tackle it. And I think some of the regulation in the UK has actually helped some of the banks take their responsibility and control improvements on receiving payments. That's definitely led to some improvements, and making sure that we're ready for the regulation when it came in. The thing that it doesn't do, however, is stop the money getting to the fraudsters typically. And that's the problem with it, that it doesn't actually take it out at a gross level across the industry, which is what we need to see across the next few years.
That's a fantastic point to finish the first half of our conversation on. So we'll take a quick pause here and have a quick break, after which we will discuss how fintechs and financial services firms can develop their capabilities to fight back against fraud and talk through some of those questions about cross-industry initiatives. So that'll all come up after this super quick break, so don't go anywhere.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Welcome back to Fintech Insider Insights, where we're discussing fraud. Before the break, we looked at how countries around the world have seen a massive increase in fraud over the past year and some of the reasons that are driving that growth. So now we're going to start taking a look at some of the technologies available to fintechs and financial institutions to help them fight back against the fraudsters. Ilya, let's start with you. How can firms go about developing technical capabilities to reduce some of this risk? I mean, we talked before the break about, how there's sort of things companies need to do with other companies, but there's things they need to do to sort of get their own houses in order. Let's start on that sort of narrow question. What are the things that companies can do to protect themselves and their customers from the risks of fraud?
Yeah, look, I think you have to look at it in two stages, right? There's the account creation onboarding stage where lots of this fraud are happening, and your tools there have to be, up to scratch, modern, and basically being able to quickly react to whatever the new trends are, like deepfakes, for example, right? Like fraudulent networks. there's a second point that, our own statistics show that 70% of fraud actually happens after account opening. For obvious reasons, you need to open an account to then do fraud, but the majority is after. And so you need to then monitor those transactions and activities and events very effectively. And companies have been doing this, right? But I think part of the challenge was a lot of times the teams and the systems that are used for onboarding sit in one place, and then the teams and the systems that used for ongoing monitoring sit in another place. The data doesn't actually, not that easy to flow and stitch. And so you end up having siloed pieces of data sitting at the organizations. They're not able to effectively use them. So, and that's part of the thesis. What we're trying to build is like this flow through, end-to-end platform where we know a lot about the user at the time of onboarding, can protect against attacks that are happening at the onboarding stage. But then you'll use all of those information signals at the ongoing monitoring stage so that we can connect those seemingly unconnected pieces of data to tell that there's a higher risk of this particular event. It can be login, password reset, or a submitted transaction. So that's, I think, where the structural change is coming. And so that's what we're really trying to do.
Dave, you talked earlier quite eloquently about the things different individual banks have done to try and protect themselves, protect their own customers, which is great. It's like kind of building a castle, and you make the castle really strong. But there's obviously this component of, well, we need to work with everyone else as well. What kinds of things are you seeing happening in the industry to work more widely, to build sort of more partnerships? We're dealing with fraud networks. How do we build stronger anti-fraud networks?
Yeah, I think the industry has collaborated well on the messaging to customers, the education and awareness campaigns, for example, through Take 5, and the alignment on that messaging. Like the bank will never call you and ask you to move money is across the industry. And I think that's been really helpful in making sure that we don't have this mismatching of messaging to customers, and to make sure that banks continue to talk about it. So you're effectively now bombarded by anti-fraud messaging across social media to kind of mitigate some of the fraud that is there. And I think that's very helpful. I think that the collaboration both between banks and between some of the public sector bodies as well has been really strong. Information sharing has grown certainly in the last few years, as well as the speed of the information flow between banks to recover funds, to work together, to sort of retain those wherever possible and repatriate them to the victim, actually does take away the fraud money from the fraudsters. And that's really important to navigate that out and to play our part across the task force that exists certainly in the UK, and there's also task forces in Sweden, in Denmark, for example, as well, to do that and to drive that through. And the next step is that international collaboration that we need to display the disruptive part in some of the offshore call centers that we have, and where we know we all have victims throughout the chain that exists there, and that would actually sort of step in and take some of that element that's really causing harm to our countries and our customers.
Thank you. Vinita, what's your view on the importance of partnerships in fighting fraud?
I think it's definitely critical, and banks have to decide, because a lot of what we've been discussing is that it's not a single firm that can solve any of this. This is entirely about the ecosystem. Whether we look at the ecosystem within the UK context or within the public-private partnership, it's all about no one's going to win this alone on their own. So that's absolutely critical. Within the bank, though, I would say, even before we break out of the bank and say, what else can I do externally? I think there's so much that within firms that we could do better. So going back to Ilya's point, what is the data that's sitting with a firm, and what are the processes within that, and what are the silos within an org? For example, if there's one unit trying to look at vulnerability and consumer duty, trying to make sure that, everyone's got access, and another extreme is trying to keep all the right controls in place, there needs to be more dialogue to ensure that we're looking at this end to end, because fraudsters only need that weakest link. They don't need every link to be weak. And that's where we need to think more smartly about this.
How do you go about doing that? What are some of, I realize you're not necessarily going to tell us everything that you're doing, but what are some of the sort of approaches, some of the ways of thinking about sort of trying to unify some of that data, share data across firms, identify some of the sort of weaker links within the organization? Can you share with our listeners a couple of the sort of steps that you can take?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things I've done in past life is looked at, when it comes to like strong customer authentication, to say what are the various doors that a bank has. So if I have a payment proposition, a lending proposition, and everything that as a bank I'm doing, what are all the doors out there? How many of them are bolted properly? So really go through with a fine tooth comb rather than just say, okay, now here's what I've lost. I've lost, let's say, 10 million in fraud, but where? Have I lost it where card was present, card not present? Have I lost it in, open banking? Where is it actually gone through? And what specifically needs to be done? And another thing I think often organizations aren't so good at is just following the money. Because you'll have one unit which is going grow, grow, grow. I want to get out there and I want to grow my product. I want to launch international payments or whatever else. There's another side which then becomes your second line or your traditional compliance teams, which will say, oh, slow down because, this isn't right. But if we followed the P&L to say, here's my product, it generated a revenue of 6 million, but the fraud losses against that product are 5 million. Then it starts to get real. And that connection is something that a lot of people haven't made yet. And it causes friction internally, which then stops us from being able to use that data in a constructive way.
Dave, do you recognize some of what Vinita is talking about? Obviously, applies across many firms, but do you recognize some of that?
Absolutely. And trying to give people the full visibility of that P&L is actually really important. And then you get it to a point of, well, whose decision is it then? Is it the person that is pushing the product owners, or is it the people that are managing the risk? And they may or may not be the same people. And that's where you get into some complex discussions. But creating that visibly for people to see is important. And also to share the trending on fraud. And we've certainly seen the places that I've been working, including Danske Bank, the interest in fraud and what we are saying is definitely growing. I can tell by the distribution of our monthly MI report just how many people are interested in what's going on across the business. And trying to have those transparent and open discussions and educating people internally is just as important as supporting customers externally, in my opinion.
So, Ilya, what's the opportunity for more industry-wide collaboration, at least within the financial services industry? Because Danske Bank must have people trying to commit fraud at Danske Bank who the same day are going to Jyske Bank or SEB or whoever. Same thing in the UK. A customer tries to commit fraud at Monzo, at Revolut, at NatWest, at Tandem, whoever. A company like yours sees a bit more of that. How much more opportunity is there to just share information about known fraudsters, false identities? How much opportunity is there for more collaboration across the industry on this common joint problem?
I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the ways sometimes we can see fraud happening at one place and then moving to another. But we've already seen that being fraud. So talking about us specifically, our ability to use this data in an anonymized way across industries, companies. And by the way, we work a lot with more of the higher risk industries. We work a lot with crypto. So we see that fraud coming there first and then sort of perpetuating further. So ability to use that data and having the right to use the data is critical to us. And we always ask our clients when we work to allow us for that purpose, for kind of fraud prevention and product training purpose to use that data. And that's why, we're able to translate the, 10 plus million users on board monthly globally into better AI models that, catch deepfakes and catch fraudulent documents, synthetically generated documents. So I think that's would companies collaborating more actively, not just through us, but directly on fraud. I mean, in an ideal world, yes. Then you kind of get into the challenge of like, what does that data need to look like? How it needs to be protected, but also even basically like, how do you make sure the data is consistent so it's usable? So I think there's a little bit more challenges on the fraud side, collaborating. But look, consortium, fraud models in terms of anti-fraud consortia have worked very well in cards and other types of payments. So I think we'll get there as well. But at least being able to, for providers like us, being able to use that data across clients is a very big step forward.
Thank you. Vinita.
I think absolutely agree with all of that. And another thing we've got to do is, one is sharing the data, but the other is then putting it to good use. Like, what are we actually doing with it? So I was reading the annual report on SARS, and across the country, we filed just under 1 million SARS over the suspicious activity reports over the course of a year. And this was for 2022 to 23. Now, in that, what actually happens after that? So were these useful? Were they not useful? What happened? So there is a ton of data and we're drowning in data. But what are we actually then? Are we able to whittle through those and say, this is what you told me and this was really helpful because here's what happened? I was just doing the hours to say, okay, if one SAR just took me, an hour to do it, we're talking about 500 people just sitting there and writing these. If we're not using AI or generative AI and we're sitting and just writing these things, then what is coming out at the other end? So we need to get smarter at having that dialogue, but in a cyclical manner and close that loop. I saw this, I told you this, what did you do? What do you want me to do next time? And how does this whole thing work together? All the law enforcement agencies together. And it has to not just be, that's not my problem and that's, crime agency versus that's police. It has to all just connect like, pieces of Lego blocks.
So there's a real need for a much more holistic fraud capability, but not just at a national level, but also at an international level, because the fraud that's turning up in Denmark is probably some of the same fraudsters turning up in the UK or India or wherever in the world we happen to be.
I think also the change in the UK regulation, which shifts the burden of some of that cost back on the organization, I think that's important as well, because usually it was to be like it's either the merchant's problem or the consumer's problem. Like the bank has, as Dave said, protected themselves, and so it's the weaker parties that had to carry the burden, the small merchant or the individual. Now putting that a little bit back kind of internalizes that cost and makes sure that the organizations, the entities that actually have the resources and can organize themselves are tasked with doing that. So I think that's actually a good example of the change in regulation in the right direction. So,
yeah, sorry, Vinita, sorry.
Just on the regulation. But just another really interesting way that when you were saying, Ilya, at the start, that people are, more using digital banking and more of the money is, utilized that way. Now, the thing we've got to understand is if I had cash under my mattress, would I go around giving the keys away? To my home? I wouldn't, right? I would guard that key. So if the cash is now sitting in the bank, how much do I guard my OTP? How much do I guard my bank account? So I was just reading the regulation in Singapore. There's the CDSA and the CMA, which basically now is putting the accountability on people to ensure that they don't share that detail. So they, there is kind of consequences for negligent use of the account. So you've got to make sure your account's being used properly. You're not sharing your SingPass details where you think there could be a risk of fraud. So we should also take that back down to Dave's point, that education, but also that personal accountability to say, well, I should treat this as though it was sitting at my home. Just because it's sitting in a bank doesn't mean I can be more responsible and because I will be compensated.
Can I just build on that a little bit by saying I think it should be proportionate. So the amount that you sort of do on your due diligence when you're buying a house or buying a car is significantly more than you would spend buying a low value item on Facebook Marketplace. And I think that's the world that we have to get to, where it is a joint responsibility with the customer and it's proportionate to the activity that they're doing. And sometimes that doesn't feel that it's always the case, and it doesn't seem to be sort of reflecting that in the regulation, for example.
Dave, I want to pick up on something you said earlier, because we were just talking about the sort of responsibility of individuals. We talked about the responsibility of banks. And of course, the bank is often the vector that the money gets out from. The criminals get the money out of the bank. But you talked about social media companies. And obviously, social media companies are the place where a lot of these deep fakes and so on are originating. You mentioned, certain marketplaces and so on that are often being used to sell on stolen goods and so on. But also, those social media profiles are often the origin of false identities, and they're also where identities are getting stolen. So what's the role of social media in this? Obviously, people love social media, but social media is also creating a huge attack surface for fraudsters. Do you have any thoughts on how countries might start to tackle that?
The way the regulation works, certainly in the UK, is to sort of put the responsibility where the harm is. Typically, that's the principle that's always been in place. And for me, the harm is being started on social media, and therefore they have the responsibility to implement the controls. The complexity about actually sort of putting in the legislation and the regulation around that is, I think, why we're seeing some of the delays that we are in getting to that point. Though we're seeing other legal entities like Australia who are sort of proposing that and going a little bit further than perhaps the UK are. So it is possible, and we need to do that. But we also need to work collaboratively with them so that when we find something that a customer tells us is a scam, we can report it to them and they take it down. That's another sort of a sensible approach so that the next customer doesn't fall for the same thing. The other thing that I think is important to note from the bank's perspective is that we're often at the very end of the chain. So we don't get to see the whole story of what the customer's seen that's led them up to the point that they made the payment, which makes those difficult decisions more difficult, or whether or not we're going to deny or delay that payment whilst we do some investigation with the customer. And the more liability we have, the harsher we will be on those rules, or the more information we'll ask in order to support that payment. So that's what I mean about the shared responsibility. And maybe the social media companies could share the information about an advertisement, for example, that would help us make those decisions and help us do right by the customer.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time because I would happily talk to the three of you for the remainder of the day because this is such a huge and fascinating topic. So I'm going to give you one final question. I'm going to ask all three of you to answer the same question. So we've heard from the great work that Sumsub has done that effectively, fraud is growing. Fraudsters are doing very well. It's a very lucrative business model. And now armed with powerful tools like artificial intelligence, fraud is booming. So can we give our listeners reasons to feel optimistic that things can get better, or that there are things that the fintech industry, the regulators, and others can do? Ilya, let's go to you first. A reason to feel optimistic.
Yeah, look, my main reason is you have new tech that fraudsters use, but then you can also use the same tech to effectively fight it. And so the ability to use AI for fighting fraud, detecting patterns that you wouldn't be very hard to detect without it, to doing this also efficiently, also at scale. I mean, that does give me hope. So once you have the right models on the right data and you can react quickly, you can actually quite effectively combat a large portion of it. But that, of course, as we discussed, that need to be combined with pieces around it, the right regulations, right? We didn't actually talk almost nothing about education, and educating people about these risks and what to do in those cases. But I think certainly the ability to use that AI to sort of that tech to fight fraud gives me reasons for hope.
Thank you. Vinita.
I would absolutely think that there is a reason for hope. And the reason, in my view, is the tech. In addition to that, is the human in the middle, right? So I think we are starting to normalize these conversations. We're normalizing talking about fraud, talking about scams. We see adverts out there saying, be careful with your information. Look around, do you see something suspicious? And that is what will make the difference, because the machines can do what the machines can do, but it's the humans which are usually the weakest link. So we need to be alert and aware.
Thank you. And Dave.
We've built up more and more data about scams in particular over the last few years that will help us make those better decisions. So whilst the root cause might be negative, actually, the quality of our decision-making, our ability to detect, is becoming better and better over time. And that's where I hang my hat on hope.
Thank you. All right. Well, that unfortunately wraps up today's discussion. I wish we'd had more time. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining me. Where can people find out more about you all? Vinita, where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Thank you. You can find me on LinkedIn and also vinitaramtri.com.
And Dave?
Same for me, Dave Laramy on LinkedIn.
And Ilya?
I won't be too original, but LinkedIn is the best place to find me, and more broadly about our findings in the report we have on our website, so sumsub.com.
Thank you. And you can find me, Benjamin Ensor, on LinkedIn, and you can find out about the work the team are doing at 11fs.com. So thank you all so much for listening. If you like what you've heard, please do follow our podcast or do leave us a review. Let us know what you'd like to hear about in the future. If you want to join the conversation, find us on social media. Just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider, or you can email us at podcast@11fs.com. Thank you all so much. Thank you again to my guests, and goodbye.
Bye.